Israel versus Iran. It's no longer theater. It's no longer a signaling mechanism as it may have been a year ago. This is now an attempt by Israel to A, take out Iran's nuclear program, and B, potentially remove the regime entirely, or at least weaken it to the point where it falls.
How big a hit has there been to Iran's oil infrastructure so far?
Well, in the fog of war, it's hard to be precise, but what we can see so far is minimal in terms of its ability to continue to export to the world, which it's not supposed to be doing because of sanctions anyway, but everybody knows that it does. But where we have seen significant impact is domestically, where refineries have been hit, a gas field has been hit, and it appears there is a deliberate attempt to disrupt the distribution of fuel. And if you read anecdotal reports, and that's all we have for now, from the capital city, Tehran, petrol has already run out at the Bowser. So people who are trying to flee, if they don't have a full tank, can't even do it.
Are there any reasons, Michael, to believe that this won't be a prolonged conflict and that Israel and Iran are indeed looking for off-ramps?
Well, if you're a market optimist who doesn't understand geopolitics, which is the majority of them, then yes. And if you're a realist who understands the region, then no, because this conflict has been running for years in various different forms, both rhetorically and via various different proxies, as I'm sure you're aware of. And now we are at the final event, as it were. Israel versus Iran. It's no longer theater. It's no longer a signaling mechanism, as it may have been a year ago. This is now an attempt by Israel to A, take out Iran's nuclear program, and B, potentially remove the regime entirely, or at least weaken it to the point where it falls. That makes it existential for Israel, and they openly say it is, that they cannot allow the regime to remain in place and develop a nuclear weapon. And it's existential for the regime, because if they fear they're going to fall, well, obviously that's the end of the revolution. So no, this doesn't appear to be something that will be over quickly.
And so what is your view then on just how much damage Israel is willing to impart, not just on Iran's local economy, given what you've just said about instigating regime change, but on the global economy and given the implications and disruptions you've already talked about as regards oil supplies?
Well, I think the one target potentially that Israel may go for as it continues to escalate, or both sides continue to escalate, the one that's likely, but not a given by any means, because I don't think the US would be in favor, is Karg Island, which is very easy to hit and which they haven't touched so far, which is Iran's main export channel. But I want to be very clear here. I think the far greater risk is that Israel leaves that export infrastructure untouched, not just because that's what America wants, but it's because what the rest of the world wants. But in removing the nuclear threat and in dealing with the regime to ensure the regime isn't there to start the nuclear threat again in another couple of years, it weakens it to the point where the Iranian regime itself decides that as a suicide pill or a cyanide pill, that it will try to mine the Strait of Hormuz or threaten to mine the Strait of Hormuz or do something like that, which even rhetorically would see insurance rates for oil tankers in the region go through the roof, at which point, as we've seen with the Suez Canal, traffic would drop off sharply because it's no longer worth it. And were that to happen, then it would be the Iranians who are actually causing that as a signaling device at the very least, if not, as I said, as a if I'm going down, you're coming with me event, to try and get the rest of the world to step in and stop this war from happening, which at the moment is nowhere near happening.
And so how do you see implications for spikes in inflation, for example, at this point?
At this point, we've had, what, a 15, 20% tick up in oil prices cumulatively from the lows, which is not nothing if it's sustained. That would definitely be a moderate little inflationary impulse, although we have a lot of deflationary impulses in some other areas. So nothing to really panic about yet. But were this, as I said, to head towards the kind of political scenarios I just described, where the regime starts to feel it's under threat, and that's no longer impossible, then yes, potentially they would be the ones to trigger something quite significant. And if that were to happen, for a while at least, you could see very high oil prices and energy prices globally. But presumably, of course, the rest of the world would then have to step in one way or another and try and rectify that. So if in the worst case scenario, it could be very high, but not necessarily for very long.
Central banks tend to look through one-off price hikes, but for how long do you believe interruptions would have to last before that rising oil price becomes materially significant for central banks, including Australia's RBA?
Well, it's a good question, and they failed it abysmally during the Russia-Ukraine conflict when energy prices spiked. And we saw that they repeated all the errors of the 1970s to a degree and then had to hike more than expected afterwards to try and compensate. It's unclear what they would do. But I do think if they felt that we had a permanent energy supply shock, say somehow, and I'm not forecasting this, something happened to the Strait of Hormuz that would take months and months to undo, and again, that's very, very unlikely, then it would be much harder to look through because that is a one-off structural supply shock that just doesn't go away. Then, of course, they could still pivot and say, well, it isn't about demand, so we're still not going to raise rates. It really depends what they want to do with rates rather than what they should be doing with them.
And so 4 days in, what are the risks that you see to global growth? And is it too early to be talking about whether the outbreak of hostilities in the Middle East could induce a worldwide recession?
Oh, we're nowhere near that from what's happened so far. I think, again, people are misreading where things really are worrying and where they aren't. Where they're worrying is that we now have yet another war going on. And again, with energy resources there, that absolutely is something we should be concerned about. But if you look at the strikes which Israel has managed to inflict on Iran and which Ukraine recently managed to inflict on Russia too, what you're seeing is with a lot of forward planning and very, very low cost, you can absolutely decimate a country using just drones. You don't need much else to start with. What do you think Australia is doing to prepare for that? And I can tell you the answer is absolutely nothing at the moment. What do you think most Western countries are doing? Despite the fact we've just seen that other actors for very low cost can disrupt everything around us. So that's the larger issue for me. That's the bigger fear. Although, as I said, the risks are there, a tail risk at that. There's something that things could get much worse for a short period in terms of energy vis-a-vis the Middle East. But, as I said, I'm focusing on other things.
Good to speak to you, Michael Every. Thank you.
Thank you.